Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the planning meeting today. We have one item. It's the missing middle affordable housing in Bellingham. We have a few panelists here today. I'd like to announce right off the bat that we'll usually go for 45 minutes, then we'll take 15 minutes of public comment. So, April, you want to introduce our panel?
Oh, yeah.
They can introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'll let each person introduce themselves. But we're here today to continue a conversation on affordable housing that bore out of our town hall on housing. Originally, we started working on rental barriers and concerns and brought some direction to council that they approved, and that's in staff's hands now. So we're kind of chunking away at the affordable housing, which right now I think it's good to discern. There's affordable housing that's subsidized, and then what some people would call natural affordable housing, which sometimes you'll hear it, the little a compared to the big A, which is subsidized housing. We invited the school district to come, recognizing that they've been redrawing their boundaries for two reasons. One is to, we've had a lot of growth to the north side, which is increased class sizes immensely, and actually we don't have enough room in those schools currently for the growth that's happening. And then we've also recognized that the other schools don't have a great balance of social economic diversity. So they brought forward a really great understanding for us to look at it through a school district lens, and understanding that our neighborhoods and how they are developed actually impacts our schools, and it impacts the learning of our children. So I think after that conversation, we gave staff some direction, and they need a little bit more time on that. We thought we would come to this very interesting conversation about the missing middle that's happening across America right now, and that would be things like duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, and attached and detached ADUs, which currently we don't allow in every single family zoning, but we do allow in some. So we've invited you all here with experience, interest in that, and just to help us understand a little bit better. And I guess with that, each one of you could introduce yourself, and then we'll continue.
My name is Carrie Veldman. I'm with the RJ Group. I'm a project manager, and we do development in the city of Bellingham.
My name is Sarah Gooden. I'm a longtime resident of Bellingham, and I have very vested interest in affordable housing.
My name is Ali Taishi, and I have a business in Bellingham, ABT Consulting, that does land use permitting and project management, also a planning commissioner.
Okay, who would like to start? You? Go ahead.
I could give a prompt. Is that going to be easier? I think just understanding this affordable housing in this missing middle, and your context, and understanding, is it something that's out there, viable, people are asking about, what's your experience with it, and how it relates to Bellingham might be a good start.
Sure, that's a great prompt. So we have roughly 500 units in permitting right now with the city of Bellingham, all of which are multifamily or the missing middle, which is the attached product. And our goal is to really capitalize on those that can't afford these, the majority of what's being built in Bellingham right now, which is single family homes, and those are priced out of many first-time home buyers' price ranges. And so a lot of what you'll see from us in the future are those attached product. We're doing shared court, lots of infill toolkit projects, townhomes, garden court housing, shared court housing. We've done ADUs. We recently completed a project over on Peabody Street in the Fountain District Urban Village, and that was more of our test case scenario, where we did townhomes with flex spaces that you could use as a business or contiguous space with your main unit. And we did attached ADUs. And we learned a lot about the process of going through the city with the infill toolkit and kind of seeing who's buying these products. Is this even a viable product within the city of Bellingham? And the results were interesting. I just did a long, basically post after project study of like who bought them and why, and a lot of it was older single women, and they loved the idea of living close to their neighbors and having that community, but also being able to age in place where they had that rental income to offset their mortgage. And so That was really interesting and really great to hear because we're taking those comments and feedback and applying it to our next projects, which was the whole point of doing the Peabody project. And the one thing that we so far haven't been able to utilize in our project designs moving forward is that strong desire to have that single level ADU on the main floor, no stairs essentially, to be able to stay and age in place in your unit. And a lot of that has to do with trying to maximize your density and use your floor space, or excuse me, use your land efficiently. And with just the rising cost of development, not just saying particularly in Bellingham, but across the board, that's really hard to achieve, but I would like to try to see how that can be implemented in designs moving forward. But so far, we have no plans to do single-family homes moving forward on our designs. We are doing single-family homes in Cordata right now, and they're more of a cottage style. And what we've seen a lot is the older generation. They are not. The single-family detached, excuse me. But right now, we're selling them at foundation level, as you can imagine. But we're the only developer in town that I know of, that I've heard of, selling those products within the entry-level pricing, about 300,000, early, low 300,000s. What else can I say? Basically, that's what our goal is.
I have a few questions here. What is the price range of the Peabody units, and what do you anticipate the next project price range to be with these attached units?
The Peabody Townhome project sold for a lot more than we anticipated. Just learning a lot. We had a range of homes. There were 7 units in Peabody, the smallest ranging from 1,200 square feet, and that was a middle unit without an ADU or a flex space, and that sold for $339,000. The largest unit, which was close to 2,300 square feet, which had an attached ADU, that sold for $469,000, and that was a 4-bedroom unit plus an ADU, so essentially a 5-bedroom unit.
Okay. And then what elements of the infill toolkit did you find the most effective, and what did you find to be the least effective?
Right, so great question. Right now, the infill toolkit housing form that works the best without requesting departures from code was the townhome style. That gets you the largest floor space per land. 0.75 FAR gets you to maximize your square footage on your lot. And that's basically how we chose to go with that infill toolkit housing form. Moving forward, we're doing garden court and shared court, and we basically have a matrix of departures that we're requesting from the city in our permitting process, but we're working closely with the planning department, and they recognize that these departures are insignificant to the community, and that they actually create better designs and efficient housing forms, and it gets you essentially in a more efficient land form.
Thank you.
When you were talking about the townhomes that you were building, you say the older people were buying those too? No. You said older, and then I missed the rest of it.
The main demographic for the Peabody townhomes were older single women.
I heard that part.
We did have one family move in to one of the units that had an ADU, and there was another I think one of the units was a family who bought it for their college daughter who lives on site, and they rent out the ADU as well.
Okay, then it was, I guess, the Cordata, where you built into Cordata.
Yes.
Who was buying those?
Same demographic, retired couples.
And then when you say multifamily, and you're talking about some of these other smaller kinds of multifamily, when you say multifamily, do you have a certain size multifamily you're building, or does it just depend on the location or whatever?
It depends on the location. We have multifamily rental units. So right now we have a project out off of June Road, and that's a very different multifamily form where it's more of a townhouse style. There's some garages, lots of smaller building units, building sizes with smaller units inside. And then also under construction over off Stewart Road is one giant multifamily building with 83 units. So just capturing different types of demographics in the market through the multifamily component.
Okay, thank you.
Carrie, you mentioned the price points for the Peabody project. In your subsequent projects using a similar form, do you think the price points would be reduced? Do you think what contributed to the higher demand for the ones in Fountain?
Our goal would be to essentially hit that first-time home buyer price point, which would be lower than the Peabody project. The Peabody project had the ADU component, which allowed people to utilize that rental income to offset their mortgage. A lot of what right now our projections don't have ADUs, so therefore the price points will be lower. And of course, our new projects are out in the north end where this is all happening, and not as an established area, therefore a lower price point would be warranted.
Do you have a handle on like a percentage or a number of units that sold above asking price?
We had one unit at Peabody that sold for above asking price. Everything else was at asking price. And the one unit that did sell below asking price by, I believe, $10,000 was the one that did not have an ADU. When people started, when these went on the market, people were very interested in the one without the ADU because it was the less expensive unit. It didn't have the ADU. The ADU kind of scared people. They didn't know, how, do I want to be a landlord? Do I want to take on that responsibility? How do I do this? You know, there was forms where we had to, you know, you have to be an owner on site to be a renter for the ADU. That kind of essentially scared people off a little bit. But then once we kind of explained, well, look, you could get X amount of $100 for your ADU and offset your mortgage and therefore have a better spacier unit, then it started creating some buzz, and then all of a sudden only the ones with ADUs were left on the market, and then we were left with the one that had the most traffic in the beginning, but then that was the last to sell. And also what was interesting was the first Peabody unit was harder to sell because there were no market comparables. There's no brand new build in an established neighborhood with an ADU. How do people find financing? How do people get their appraisal to justify that value in their mortgage? And so the first one that sold was to a woman who paid cash. And therefore it set our comparable unit, and therefore people could start getting their appraisals and mortgages to justify purchasing other units.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
My name is Sarah Gooden. I'm a local marketing professional and a single parent, and I believe I'm here to address the immediate need for middle housing, in that I benefit from subsidized housing. As a college graduate, as a working professional in the city of Bellingham, there are no opportunities for me or families like mine as a single earner for my household of 2. The Peabody project is wonderful, and it's done a great thing for the city in establishing multifamily housing again in new builds, and I really appreciate what the RJ Group is doing, but there is no building that's happening for me or my family. The fact that to buy a house in the city of Bellingham, the starting price is now $300,000 it might as well be $1 million for someone like me. After saving for 5 years, I'm persistently priced out of every house. The lowest house in the York neighborhood that requires the most work is still well outside of my means. And there are many, many families just like mine all over the city. My interest here is to discuss accessory dwelling units. Primarily, my dream would be to own a tiny home and rent a space in an established neighborhood with a good school district, with some zoning flexibility and things like that, which would provide an opportunity for a family like mine to own our own home and then still be able to rent within the city limits, to stay in the school district where my son has grown up and where I went to school.
Jeez, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
All right.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Thank you for coming, Sarah. I know it takes courage to talk about your own personal situation and how you're being impacted as a longtime resident and mother. And I think it kind of brings us back to that school district question of when we know schools are so valued, when people are moving, and what Dr. Baker hopes to get beyond is they're choosing schools and not neighborhoods necessarily. With that, I want to bring up some information that came from our Community Solutions work group with the mayor. A gentleman that works for the Bellingham Housing Authority said that he'd really like us to try to address some of these systemic problems that are causing a bottleneck in our subsidized housing, and that is that currently what you're seeing with a lot of families, even in double income earning families, is either you're going to live extremely highly burdened, stressed, to maintain whatever you already currently have or trying to buy something, or you're going to leave Bellingham, or you're going to figure out how to do subsidized housing, and then within that you're going to have to continue almost what's a game to stay right there, where if you earn a little bit more you might get kicked out. So we're having this kind of bottleneck in subsidized housing, where I think you might provide an example of somebody who is actively wanting to go out and seek something and move up that, what we call that social mobility, but is locked a little bit because the lack of flexibility. And then when you see the flexibility in these affordable home styles, this missing middle, they're predominantly on the north side, which we already know that school's overburdened. A lot of people want to live in the areas where they grew up. So I think that's certainly something that we need to be discussing with the idea of affordable housing, and that how the big A affordable housing connects with the little a affordable housing. And I wondered, either from Sarah or Ollie, since you're also on the Planning Commission, in this discussion we've been having around missing middle and middle housing forms, just more information on what you see out there and potential barriers that we have here in Bellingham we could address.
Well, I just have stories from friends of mine, working professionals with children who, as the sole providers for their household, are struggling to rent and buy. An associate professor at Western, there's a professional who works at Wadcombe Community College who's worked there for 10 years. And because with his current income, he's unable to afford to just rent a home in the city of Bellingham, he lives with multiple families in a single rental unit. A dear friend of mine is a teacher at a Montessori school and also works part-time as a waitress and rents a single room in a 3-bedroom house so that she can be in the school district that she wants for her 4-year-old or for her 5-year-old son. These are commonplace stories. These are college graduates. We are here because we love it here, but we are no longer welcome here, essentially. Where anywhere else in the country I would be able to afford a home with the savings that I have in place. Not anywhere else in the country. Wisconsin, mainly. But here, with this incredible job that I have and this wonderful community of people that I love, that I've participated in for many, many years, I could live in Sumas maybe in a couple years if I keep saving. One of the things that sticks in my mind a lot is that there is no reason why a working professional with a college degree should be taking up space in housing that is for homeless people, that is essentially to help homeless people break out of the cycles that create homelessness, mental health, fleeing from domestic violence, those sort of issues. There's a family couch sitting right now or living in a van downtown that could have a place to live and receive services that they need to break out of that cycle, and I'm taking up their space, and I don't need that space. So if we provide more flexibility for things like accessory dwelling units, infill in established single-family neighborhoods, that provides more spaces for families like mine.
Thanks. You mentioned being on planning commission, but I actually think that my experience as like a lifetime resident here actually gives me more or influences what I see on this more. You know, I'm in my 30s. I have a family. I have tons of friends that I grew up with here who still live here or I'm still friends with. So I see a lot of my peers dealing with housing issues and jobs and things like that. And that actually, I think, has brought more perspective to me than anything. And having a kid now who I'd like to have live here one day and have a job. And what I'm seeing is that, similar to what Carrie talked about and what you're talking about, it's really difficult to find anything other than an apartment if you're young. I have 4 employees who are in their 20s in my company, and all of them would like to own a home. I think there's a misconception that everyone wants or is happy to live in an apartment when they're young, and there are lots of people who are okay with that, but the reality is that as you grow and you transition, you still want to live in a home. And I think that American dream is like change. You don't need a 2,500 square foot house on a 10,000 square foot lot. The people who work for me tell me they want to buy a home, but they're okay with a tiny yard, and they're okay with a 1,000 square foot home, 2-bedroom home. You know, they understand that you don't get as much anymore for maybe what you pay, and that's different than what it was like, you know, when my parents grew up. It's just a different dynamic. But it's clear that those people still want that, and so I see us building a lot of apartments in Bellingham to accommodate people in rental housing, and I think we're packing a lot of units in the past 5 years, and in my business we're doing a lot of apartment permitting, and so I think we're building out that capacity a little bit. But there's clearly, in my mind, there's clearly a lack of supply for single family homes. I think we all see that. There's, you know, every single house that goes in the market has a price war, you know, $30,000, it goes up, and that affects the affordability of those homes, and it's kind of self-perpetuates because then the comps are higher, so then people price higher, and it just kind of keeps building, I think. And what we're seeing in my business is a lot of people exploring use of the infill toolkit, it's only allowed in multifamily neighborhoods, but we're seeing builders and developers do the analysis and say, I could build a 6-unit apartment on this property in a multifamily zone in Roosevelt or Happy Valley or something that's zoned for 6 units, but instead of building an apartment, I'm going to go ahead and build 6 townhouses or 6 cottages because there's so much demand for fee ownership, for owning, that it's worth it for them to use the toolkit, which allows you to subdivide on substandard lot sizes and actually create lots that they can sell, homes that they can sell to people. And so when they're presented with that choice between building an apartment building like they would have done 10 years ago on that site or building 6 units, detached or attached, they're choosing that because it's still viable for them financially, and they like, partly because prices have gone up too much, but what we're seeing is people building 6-unit townhouse project or a 6-unit cottage project or a 4-unit cottage project or something like that, and trying to come in at that $300,000 price point, lower if they can. I know that that's expensive for you, but relative to what's out there, that's pretty cheap. And what I would echo what Carrie said about the toolkit. The townhouses are what people are gravitating to because it gives you the most. It's the easiest to work with. We're also asking for a ton of departures on all our other projects. That code was written, in a sense, in a vacuum, and it was a great first step. But now that we're engaging with it, we're realizing that the pieces don't all fit together really well, and it really does need some work to make it easier to accomplish those projects. But we've got people building 1,000 square foot 2-bedroom units, and they're trying to sell them for $290. and that's a lot per square foot, but it still potentially will work. And if they can get a third bedroom in that unit, then for someone like one of my employees, they can say, I can actually afford to buy that because I can rent it 2 bedrooms to 2 of my friends until I start making more money, until I progress to a point where I'm making enough money to pay that mortgage on my own. At 2 bedrooms, a lot of the problems with the toolkit is that they're squeezing the size of the home too much. So you end up with like a 600 or 800 square foot home. And at 2 bedrooms at that size, my employee can't get enough rent from that 1 bedroom to make that viable. And I've got a 26-year-old girl who's working for me who just can't even afford that. And she says, I really want to buy a house in one of our projects from one of these people we're working with, but I can't because renting 1 bedroom to my friend won't make it work. So I think one way, you've got the residential single neighborhoods and what you can do with ADUs and things like that to try and help the pricing in those neighborhoods. And then you've got big apartments. And I think part of the middle, what might help the middle is we've got all these multifamily neighborhoods that have old stock, junky old houses on big lots, and facilitating redevelopment of those properties using the toolkit to get fee ownership on those lots. Getting 6 houses that people can buy, even if they're really small, is going to help our issue way more than putting another 6-unit apartment on that property. And it also helps to change those neighborhoods. You get homeownership, you get people who value their yard, you get people who value their street front, they value their neighborhood. And so I think they're more, not that renters don't care, but that homeownership just instills you with a little bit of sense of a value for your space. So I think a big part of this, aside from like the ADU issue, is the city should try and find ways to improve that toolkit opportunity in the multifamily zones, make it easier for people to do those projects. They're actually more expensive than building an apartment right now because the way the rules are set up, you have like extra permitting you have to go through. Extra consultants you have to hire. There's design standards that require you to hire a landscape architect and do all these things. And sometimes we do the math and it's more, they're still doing them, but it's actually more expensive to do the toolkit project. And then that directly correlates to that in price point. And so I'm not saying we should sacrifice design standards. I'm not saying we should sacrifice the regulatory review, but I think it would be really helpful if we could look at ways to try and make that a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier. And if we can take a lot of these sites that have one old junky house on them, just taking Roosevelt neighborhood as an example, and have 6, 8, 10 densities and get 6, 8, 10 homeowners on those lots instead of an apartment building, I think that will go a long way toward helping the issue.
Well, I think to piggyback off our last conversation with the school district, and for those that haven't had a chance to watch it or coming up to speed, is the school district's currently trying to redraw those lines to balance that social economic diversity within schools. And there was a couple gentlemen I served on a committee that was tasked with just immediately getting 100 kids out of Cordata because the growth is so abundant to the north. And then our next step will be trying to balance that demographic. And a couple of the gentlemen were tasked with going out and just seeing what they could do. I mean, if you could slice the pie any way you could possibly do it, how could you get this balance within schools? And they were very excited, quite wonky. And when they came back, one of the gentlemen was like, April, this isn't a school issue. This is a housing issue. Like, the problem is the housing and the housing that's around the schools. It's not us. We're just going to keep playing this game where we're going to bus and ship and move, and we're never going to be designing that housing to be diverse as well as integrated for different social economic classes living together. And so I think that really spurred me, being a representative of quite unique side of Bellingham. I have the Columbia neighborhood, traditional, single family only allowed currently attached. But you'll also see within there that back in the 20s, we did allow for duplexes and sixplexes and grocery stores. I mean, and then at some point we've come in our community and said, nope, single family detached homes, that's the norm, that's what we're going to build, and you can no longer build. And I think it's very reasonable that at some point that was viable. And we've continued on with that, saying that that's the character of that neighborhood, but if we look all the way back, there was different character of that neighborhood long. So in thinking about school districts and having young children, I think many of us here have young children here in the Bellingham schools, and understanding that's valuable for all of those children, and we want that spectrum, at least I do. I think it's very valuable in education. Can you see of anything that we're currently doing now that we could work on changing that would hopefully work on that balance? And if there was, especially being in the market forces, do you even think that it would, what's viable to even do? I mean, if those neighborhoods are attractive as they are, if we were to allow something different, do you even think people would be coming forward with the projects? Just trying to think outside the box on that question of if housing is a school issue, then how do we deal with the housing piece?
I think it's really tough in some neighborhoods. You mentioned Columbia. I live in Columbia. It's fairly built out. You know, there's not a lot of opportunity for adding value or making it easier for people to get into that neighborhood. You know, you talk about things that the city's doing. I think the city's on the right track in pursuing like changes to the subdivision ordinance to allow more variety in the housing forms and the way we cluster and the things we do to achieve more density. We talk about, you know, you get on average like 60% of the density when you do a project in Bellingham because there's some, you know, there's just, I think that's true probably anywhere, but there's so many restrictions. You never really get 100%. And so I know the subdivision code is hoping to address some of that by making it easier to achieve maximum density. ADU ordinance. I think that this issue is so broad. It starts with like homeless people and it ends with, you know, wealthy people, and we have to do everything. This isn't going to be solved by allowing ADUs in single family neighborhoods. It's not going to be solved by improving the infill toolkit or subdivision ordinance or providing a shelter. It's going to be solved by doing all of those things. And that, I think that's going to impact every neighborhood in Bellingham in some way. But if we say, well, we're going to exclude this idea, you know, over here and exclude this idea over here, and we start excluding ideas, we're going to limit our bag of tricks pretty quickly. So like in a place like Columbia, you know, the only things you really can do in the Columbia neighborhood, for example, is maybe allow some small multifamily housing component and allow ADUs in some capacity. And beyond that, there's really not a whole lot you can do. But April, you're right. We talk about like neighborhood character and historical character and like what single family means. And if you go back far enough, it means something completely different than what it means to people today. Columbia probably has a multifamily structure on every block, maybe every other block if you drive around there. And they're all old, they're all non-conforming now, but at some point, people were cool with having a multifamily apartment on their block. The whole block wasn't multifamily, but so, you know, if we start looking at ways to look further back and see what was acceptable and basically made these neighborhoods what they are today that we love, then that might help open up that bag of tricks a little bit.
I would like to say, well, there's two things. I don't have any experience with building, but I do have a crazy wild idea in that for every new project that is built, we take a small portion and require it to be subsidized and provide for people who are in the most need. So if you're building 6 small cottages, one of them has to be set aside for a person working outside to break out of the poverty cycle. I know that's really probably very unpopular, and I don't know how you would do it, and so it's just a wild and crazy idea, but for every new project, there has to be a certain percentage set aside for people like me.
So what you're talking about is inclusionary zoning is the common term for it. It did make it into the comp plan in terms of it being a concept. It's not mandatory at this point. I think it's a very compelling idea. I don't know from a builder's standpoint what that looks like in terms of you know, a desire to do a project that would include that. I don't know if you can speak to that, Carrie or Ollie.
We have not looked at that. We don't know necessarily what that would entail, what that would financially look like. I know that I recently had a conversation with our finance person just to see, like, what can we do to offer at least something below market, not necessarily subsidized, because we just, it seems like a foreign language to us, unfortunately. We're definitely not opposed to it, definitely in lines with our vision of the future and what we're trying to achieve. I think that it's definitely something that we would want guidance on from just like a finance standpoint, trading, to be able to say, like, what is that percentage? Is that something that's negotiable? Development's very costly. Developers are not, they don't have, at least in our experience, they're not made of money, and they're only doing this to, at least in my experience, build better community. And we do a lot to better our projects beyond what we're required to do, and having that extra social component is something that we'd be interested in. So if somebody was willing to kind of guide us and figure out how to do that, I think that would be something that would be open.
When we
to.
have a comment, Linda, I'll let you say something. Go ahead, April.
Yeah, and I just want to come back to something that you said, Ollie, and I think, Carrie, you may be able to weigh in too. It reminded me of a project that happened recently in the Columbia neighborhood, a home that was held by somebody who was dealing with a mental illness. So the home had hoarding tendencies and other things, which really devalued the home itself. Somebody purchased it, tore down the home, built to the envelope, and sold the home for $730,000, which sold. I mean, there's a market for it. I had several people in the Columbia neighborhood come to me, and they were just they're so upset that happened, that affordable house got taken, and then we had this conversation about, well, what's allowed to be built in your neighborhood? And we were talking about school densities. And it was a very interesting conversation to say, well, if that's going to happen, there's going to be older homes. And if we have no other options besides building to the envelope and maximizing your profit with a single-family detached home, we're going to see more of that happening as homes age. So the question for them was, what if you're worried about, the diversity within your school, what if a triplex would have been allowed? If we are going to allow something to be built to that size, what do we care what's happening inside the home, if it's 2 units or 3 units? And it was interesting. It went from a conversation of like, no, we would never allow that. We don't want that kind of housing. It's going to ruin our character, to now seeing that, wow, well, this is also, by doing nothing, we're doing something. By doing nothing and leaving it the way it is, we're doing something, and the character is changing. So it was just interesting to start having that conversation of what could that look like? What if somebody built a duplex there, and then each one could have been sold for $350,000? Would a developer even be interested in doing that? Would it be viable within the community of purchasing? And is that even something we should be considering?
Or what if someone built 2 small houses that had less bulk and mass, on the site, and still ultimately achieve the same total value for the developer? I mean, you couldn't do that today. You could do it with the toolkit, but it's not allowed in a single-family zone. But you could do. We're seeing people. I mean, a lot of developers look at the bottom line. I mean, there's no hiding that. And so, when presented with multiple options, if the bottom line is the same, they're going to evaluate all those options. They're not just going to go to build the big giant house. It's probably easier to sell 2 $300,000 houses than it is to sell a $600,000 house. Frankly, there's more buyers for that. And so, I think you'd see that. And just real quick, back to the inclusionary zoning question, I think that there's a scale component to that. When you talk about including that in a project, it's probably really hard to take like a 2 or 3 or 4 unit project and require 25, 30, 40% of that project to be affordable. And you start getting into a bigger project, maybe it's easier because you're diffusing that reduced cost over a larger project. So I think that's a very interesting discussion. We had it briefly on Planning Commission, during the comp plan. We really didn't get into it very much. But I think, if it was structured correctly and there was consideration for the scale, because it comes back to what you're saying, April, is you don't want to set up a scenario where you pigeonhole people into doing something that we don't actually want, because it's the only way for them to make money. Because other than like the Housing Authority and the other nonprofits, most people are out there, they're interested in community development, but they're also trying to, just like a bread guy making bread, they're trying to make money in their business, or someone at the farmer's market. So we have to be cognizant of that as a part of the decision-making process, how we set these rules up. Are we actually encouraging what we want, or are we forcing people into making bad decisions for the community?
Ann and Rick, I think you had a comment.
I think that like one of the questions to that point is what's affordable,
Yeah.
and what's affordable to who. So are we talking 50% AMI, 80% AMI, or 100% AMI? I don't know what percentage what that falls under with the Peabody development. When that one unit went for $469, like what is that? Is that like 130%? I mean, where are we at? So I think we need to come to a consensus, or at least some agreement on if we're going to do anything with inclusionary zoning or anything along those lines, what's our target here? And what I worry most about, or I worry a lot about, is people who go to work every day, punch a clock, do what they're supposed to do, play by their rules, and then they can't afford to live in the community that they work in, and their kids almost certainly won't be able to live in this community. So I think if we got creative around like where are we at within that affordable number or affordable percentage, I think that we might be able to gain some ground there.
Rick?
Well, I think it's important to view this issue in context. This is not unique to Bellingham. You may have seen the headline in this weekend's paper that we're a 20-year low on housing stock of new housing. Nowhere in the article does it attribute to the UGA not being expanded in Bellingham as the cause for the nationwide issue. We're sharing, along with everyone else, a significant change, a sea change in affordability and ownership. Perhaps more acutely here because our change was rather rapid and very great, from affordable to unaffordable in less than 2 decades. That being said, we're aware that simple solutions won't work. The simplistic notion, if we just change this one thing, everything will be fine. It is complex, and I think the panelists have said that. You've got to look at a variety of approaches and really try to solve it. The core issues we have to face is who pays, in a sense. For folks who advocate for reduced fees, that means that all of us in the community are subsidizing that development. Is that fair? If we talk about inclusionary zoning, that means that you might have one affordable unit but 5 unaffordable units to make it work. There is an approach somewhere that blends these techniques, and that's really the discussion we have to have, and we need to be aware of the consequences of affordability. If your expectation is I'm always going to have a parking spot in front of my house, but I also want affordability, then that expectation will need to change. I might have a parking spot on my block I could get to. But I realize by doing that, I might have greater affordability for folks who live in the community. So that's, I think, how the comprehensive plan sets up this discussion, is trying to weigh all of these issues and try to balance them into the fair solution. And I think we are on the right track at a number of the approaches, but there's certainly more we can do.
Rick, it's funny you mentioned that parking issue because I live in the Columbia neighborhood, and I don't get to park in front of my house. I park down the street because we have a lot of people on our street, and a family that lives across the street from me just bought their home. It was very expensive for her, and she moved a friend of hers who has a young son, probably because they want to go to Columbia Elementary School, into their home. And so they're effectively living with 2 families in one home. And that's helping her afford her mortgage, but it also brings like 3 cars to our block. And at first that kind of bothered me, but then once I kind of realized what the dynamic was, I met these people, and I want her to be successful in her purchase, then I'm not complaining anymore about parking a half block away from my house. They have 4 cars because there's a lot of people. And it's just, that's like you just said, Rick, it's kind of like that is something that may just be an impact that we have to deal with if we're going to address it. And Dan, you hit it on the head, is what are we targeting for? We have a really good community of nonprofits here that are building truly subsidized housing, 50% AMI. They're getting money from the feds, they're getting money from the state. And I'm concerned about the people you talked about, who are going to work every day and working hard, sometimes 2 people, having a kid, and how do we capture them? And I think that's the whole point of this, right, is how do we capture them?
Okay, go ahead, April, then we're going to open it up to the public.
I just want to come back to the Pew Charitable Trust study, and it's interesting. You can look at it. I'll see if I can post it on our webpage. for the city. But they found that the greater economic mobility, where neighborhoods had a wide range of income compared to neighborhoods who did not. So that economic mobility, it's that diversity I think we all appreciate in our schools, and we know it's better for our children. The question is, do we value it for ourselves? And I think that will be a very interesting conversation, because for us to move forward, we're going to be doing something. And if we value that for our children when they go to school, do we value that for us when we walk down our street? So that same question of who gets to live on your street, and if you're advocating for equality, and if you're advocating for diversity, if you're advocating for all of these things, but yet you're within a system and you're advocating that that system stays the same, we're gonna kind of miss there. And I think that this conversation, it's a unique opportunity for us to drill down into these root causes of inequality. And I think I agree, Ollie, of we're going to have to come at this from a multi-pronged, and I think we are doing that, and this committee is kind of unique in that it's housing a lot of that, but we are going to have to move, I think, quicker than normal, and we're also going to have to remind ourselves, and I'll keep coming back to that because it really resonates with me, but by doing nothing, we are doing something. We can see the changes right here in our community. So there's going to be a point where we're going to have to match our values of wanting to protect the environment, to be socially integrated, to be fiscally responsible with our resources in the city. But that's also going to mean that maybe our values within what we're willing to buy and what we're willing to look at and what we're willing to be developed is also going to have to change. So I hope that, I actually have great faith that this community, if any community, because it is happening across the nation, that we are capable, especially being as progressive as we are, to look at these things, to kind of let go of our old emotional hot buttons and the things that have happened in the past and really try to work on housing for everyday people. So
Okay.
I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Ellie?
I grew up in a missing middle neighborhood. I mean, that's where I grew up, which is why.
Thank you,
Thank you, Dan.
boss.
Thank you, whoever you are in the
Dan.
sky. Anyway, I grew up in a missing middle neighborhood. Diverse, basically jobs and incomes. There wasn't a lot of cultural diversity. There wasn't a lot of ethnic diversity back in 1950, but there was a lot of income diversity. And so to me, going back to that, not going back, I mean, that's how I think of our community. And one of the things I know is in my neighborhood, there was GI Bill. It was after World War II. My dad and mom built their little 3-bedroom, 1-bath, probably 900 square foot house on the GI Bill. So they did have a subsidy from the federal government, but there was a lot of people in the neighborhood who didn't, who were teachers and fishermen, and there were a couple of lawyers and CPAs. I mean, there was a whole mix of people. So I think the idea that Dan was bringing up is a good one, in that the first community solutions work group that we did had to do with affordable housing unsubsidized. So it was, how do you make housing in the community available without the Home Fund or the Housing Authority or the Goshen Land Trust or whatever it was, just for this missing middle people. And that was Seth and I in 2012. So we have been talking about this for quite a while. I'm happy to see that the conversation is getting a little bit more legs, because the crisis is getting a lot bigger. My house, just for the last example, and then I'll be quiet, my husband and I bought in 1983 our house on Eldridge. And we bought it for $89,000. And we sold it, I think, in 1998 for $220,000 or $290,000, and it was just listed for $889,000, and it sold in a week. Now that doesn't mean it sold for 10 times what my husband paid for it in 1983, but it means that the cost of housing in our community is just skyrocketing. So I think it's extremely important that that missing middle have opportunities across our city. I mean, it's just a better way to live, to me. So, anyway, that was my story.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're now going to go to public comment. Please line up over here. Come on up. And Marie's going to start the clock. We're going to go for 15 minutes, and you'll have 3 minutes. Go ahead, Patrick. Yeah, come right over here. Well, hang on a second until she gets the clock started here.
Hello. I'm back again.
Well, your time's up, Patrick. Thank you very much. No. There you go. Yep, go ahead, Patrick.
The term missing middle is a
Identify yourself first, Patrick.
Patrick McKee, Grant Street in Bellingham. The term missing middle is a term that was made up by groups that want to eliminate single-family zoning. I fear that Councilmember Barker is on a crusade to eliminate single-family zoning in Bellingham. Single-family zoning is in high demand, as has been said here. There is a shortage of single-family housing in the city of Bellingham. Every single-family house in Bellingham can have an attached ADU, and there are now some single-family neighborhoods which allow detached ADUs, such as carriage houses. Single-family neighborhoods are adding infill to the city of Bellingham because of the units that I just described to you. The middle housing that you're talking about exists all over the city of Bellingham. You're not creating any new housing forms. You can have triplexes and quads and detached ADUs, carriage houses. All of these housing forms currently exist and are being used in the city of Bellingham. I believe where the comp plan says that future population growth needs to be housed in the urban villages that are already planned. Now, the city has spent a lot of money planning urban villages like Old Town, and the private sector has not stepped up to the plate to start building housing in Old Town. The city needs to take proactive action. The city needs to build housing in Old Town. It was done after World War II when there were severe housing shortages. Cities stepped in and built unsubsidized housing. In other words, they built the housing and they charged the rents that would pay off the mortgages for the housing. This is the kind of action that the city needs to do to alleviate the shortage of affordable housing in this city. You need to start thinking about the urban villages that we already have planned and stop picking on the single-family neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ann Mackey. I live in the York neighborhood. Missing middle. I think something that's missing here through this whole process this summer are some key stakeholders who have not been invited to the table, to my knowledge, to talk about what they are seeing at ground zero. Neighborhood associations in the city, we all live in neighborhoods, but I don't think anyone here is wearing a hat of a neighborhood association. And I think it would be nice to have a confab like this next time where you invite neighborhood leaders to come and talk about what is happening at ground zero in their neighborhoods. And I believe those stakeholders have, I don't know if they've been intentionally excluded, but it's really unfortunate. As Patrick said, ADUs are currently allowed in all residential neighborhoods. That seems to be a recurring misstatement when I listen to comments about ADUs being built in the city, is you can have ADUs in all the residential neighborhoods. There are regulatory requirements for whether they're attached and owner occupied and, you know, how they can be located. So I think we need to come to common understanding of what the rules really are. And Rick's the expert on that and can enhance everyone. Older neighborhoods have what you're calling the missing middle housing types. York neighborhood has apartment buildings, duplexes, triplexes, quite a variety of housing that was grandfathered in back in 2009 when the city rezoned the neighborhood, part of it, to single family. But where have all the houses gone? The ones that are affordable. And I just want to give you a quick example from my neighborhood. A single-family home in the single-family zone came on the market for $350,000, an old fixer-upper. A well-known realtor and developer family swooped in, bought it for $50,000 cash above the asking price, and of course was able to put $400,000 down. They immediately moved to convert it to 8 bedrooms as an illegal rooming house, and the neighborhood has filed a complaint with the city, as have neighbors. This is what's happening. These once affordable, great older fixer-upper homes have just been gobbled up by investment groups or individuals. That's what I think the city needs to address, is how to stop that from continuing to happen. As far as the schools and diversity, the York neighborhood kids have been bused from the York neighborhood up to South Hill for over 10 years. So I would really like the opportunity, April, to talk with you about the impact of cross-city busing on a neighborhood and how that impacts folks. I think this missing middle is just a shiny new way of saying toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Linda?
Hi, Linda Twitchell, Building Industry Association, and also a mother who rents a room to her son and 2 of his mid-20 friends who cannot afford housing of their own. Virtually everybody I know in my kids' graduating class is living with their parents because they can't afford rentals or houses. So I know where we are on this. If you start considering inclusionary zoning, look at the Paddon Trails proposal from a few years ago. That is, I believe, the first and only time I heard that actually proposed. And the problem, check the figures and stuff. Right now, the median price for a home in Bellingham in the last quarter was $390,000, almost $5,000. When Paddon Trails was proposed, it was back in the 200. The median price was still in the 200s, but they figured that by offering a very small number, check the figures again, of subsidized housing, it would drive the price of every single other unit in the project up $16,000 to $20,000, which at the time was a large jump. This is the concern with inclusionary zoning, is that it nationwide, most of the studies show it has actually raised the cost of housing in a middle market like this one. You know, we're not a large city, we're more of a medium community. So please be aware of that, because if you're charging less for a few units, you have to charge more for all the rest of them to make up the difference. Another interesting point, the Happy Valley Association had a big presentation recently. They had an architect from Seattle, Bill, I cannot remember his name, what was his? Who came up, Krieger, right, he has about an hour presentation on different types of housing forms that can show you options, possibilities, what they look like. It's a very good presentation. If you're serious, I'd invite him up. It'd be a good start to get your hands on what possibilities there might be. Do they all look clunky or not, etc. So that's a thought. Let me think, there was one other. Watch the subdivision ordinance, please. We were able to look in on an earlier version of the draft, and one of our concerns, for instance, was that a larger minimum lot size was being produced, which the banks look at that and say, a larger lot, you got to have a larger house to pay for it to justify the loan. So let's keep an eye on the subdivision ordinance, and I think variety in size, shape, etc., is certainly what the Building Industry Association is looking toward as an option. You know, a means of helping people of different income levels afford different houses. It's not the old subdivision with a humongous yard of days past, but there is a national trend favoring single-family homes, especially as people become parents. So.
Thank you, Linda. Anybody else? Okay, seeing none, go ahead, Kelly.
Well, and I think Ann brings up a very good point about listening to the neighborhoods.
Use your microphone. Do we have to have a class on this?
Yes.
Go ahead.
About listening to the neighborhoods, because we did do that at MNAC last month, and it got a little hot, but almost every neighborhood came up with some ideas for different either concerns that need to be met if they had different housing forms in their neighborhood, or kinds of housing that could be built in their neighborhood that would meet their character. One neighborhood even said tiny homes, and they're kind of a neighborhood where tiny homes might actually work. But, so I just want to say that I appreciate that, Ann, and I don't think you or Patrick, Dick was at the meeting, so he can maybe fill you in. But the neighbors are now, many of the neighborhood organizations officially are willing to discuss what could work. Not, I mean, we always know things won't work, but what could work. And I really appreciate that discussion that we had. So.
I think before our process is over here, we will certainly invite people from neighborhoods and neighborhood associations to come and give your speak.
And I'll share my notes with you.
Sure, go ahead.
And
April.
for this committee in affordable housing, there's an interesting conversation going on nationwide as well about manufactured housing. Here in Bellingham, we have manufactured housing courts that house more than 100 of our students. These are those I think these little A affordable housing types that are something that I grew up in, I think maybe you grew up in as well, where it had afforded that upward mobility for families. There's a woman coming through town, she's a national expert on and has worked with other cities on these ideas of manufactured housing and how they can be very vulnerable, and she'll be here on our next meeting date, and she'd appreciate being able to come to the table and just explain some of those things to us, not make any proposals at this time, but help us understand that that is also, I think we have 6 or 7 manufactured home parks here, and we do allow them in single family neighborhoods as well. There's some cost implications there. So if you would be okay with it, I'd like to invite her, and then I know we have some information that we've been waiting for from the planning department that'll come as well. Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay, anything else? I want to thank everybody for coming. One of the alarming things I heard from Ollie was he said he was in his 30s, and that kind of backed me up a little bit.
Barely.
Because I grew up in the Columbia neighborhood 62 years ago, so I can understand what you're saying. We had almost on every corner there was a grocery store, and the people that lived in their house. You know what? I'm going to have to take this call, April, if you'd take over the rest.
April, can I just...
Yeah, we'll finish up with you, Ollie.
I was just going to say that I appreciate you inviting us to participate in the conversation. But one thing I want to make sure doesn't get lost in this discussion at the council level, I know we're talking about the affordability of housing, but I always want to remind people, we talk about this at Planning Commission, there's the whole other side of affordability is our wages and our income levels, and please don't lose track. I know there's only so much the government can do to affect change with our wages, but bringing wages up in the community, building a better job base in the community will help this issue too. It's half of the problem. Fully half of the problem. And so please don't, I appreciate that we're talking about all of the, how do we get more housing units, in different kinds of housing, but please don't forget about that component as you guys move forward in your discussion.
Yeah.
I just want to respond to that. We absolutely have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time on this issue, and that you're definitely right. That's half of the issue, is how do we encourage economic development to meet that need, because we have fairly limited tools in the toolkit on the affordable housing side of things.
Yeah.
So thanks for saying that.
Okay. Go ahead, Carrie.
One last thing, and when we were talking about the affordable housing, the kind of the baseline definition of a little a affordable housing is that 30% of your income goes to your housing costs, and we should really understand what that means and where that income level comes from compared to the housing costs here, because we have to understand what that really does mean in terms of affordability. Is $300,000 affordable? Sarah says no. So,
An associate professor's wage at Western Washington University is not enough.
We have some of that information too that the staff has put together for our meeting last